And we are at 3 after. So I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off here. And hopefully if we have any other late arrivers, we can catch them up as we go. We got a lot to get through, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to this Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition prep session. We're trying to do these throughout the spring and summer here to get folks ready for these public input sessions that states will be hosting for their Inflation Reduction Act funded home rebate programs. If you have not attended a Midwest BDC event in the past and are joining us here today, first off, welcome. Second, just a little bit about the coalition. We were founded in early 2020 with the mission to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwest building sector by 2050. And while we have members from outside of our Midwest footprint, and certainly welcome them welcome them and appreciate their contributions to the coalition. Our main priority states are Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. My name is Jacob Serfling. I'm the Director of Building Decarb Policy and Projects here at the Coalition. And this prep session is the result of a lot of hard work from our Federal Policy Working Group, which is typically co-led by myself and James Trice from the Minnesota Environmental Justice Coordinating Council, and Deirdre Navis from Western Michigan Environmental Action Council, as well as the University of Western Michigan. I believe Deirdre is actually participating in one of these state hearings in her backyard this afternoon. So I know for sure she won't be joining us. James may at some point, but certainly want to make sure that we're recognizing their contributions to what we're going to go through here today. So our agenda here this afternoon, we're going to first kind of do an overview of what we're even preparing for, what this program is, what these input sessions that we're talking about are going to be. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what you all should expect when you're participating in those hearings. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time really being thoughtful about what are the comments that we want to say, what are our priorities for this program that we're trying to relay to the states that we work in. So I'll walk through that talking points document and some of the thoughts that our coalition has had about it. And then hopefully we'll have some time to do a little bit of practice as a group, either in the main room or in some breakout rooms to give you a chance to get some reps in ahead of these sessions, getting those verbal comments out. And then we'll wrap up. So that's the agenda here for today. Before we get into any of that, just want to kind of talk about some of our typical Midwest BDC community norms that we're going to ask folks to be mindful of as we go through here today. One, we are in a regular Zoom meeting, not the Zoom webinar mode here today. So really ask folks to keep a couple of things in mind with that. One, there are going to be some interactive portions, but we don't want to be interrupting or talking over folks. So if you're looking to ask a question or have a comment during those times, if you can use that raise hand function in Zoom, or if that's not working for you, type stack or next in the chat. That just helps me as a facilitator make sure that we're not missing folks and giving folks space to speak without getting interrupted. Recognize that not everybody is able or comfortable to be on screen, and that's totally fine. We may ask folks to verify again who you are as a security thing. We have had some unfortunate incidents in the past, but hopefully that won't be a problem today. And then we're going through, some really technical policy stuff here today. So I'm going to try to watch myself, but also ask all of you when you're talking or making comments, really try to minimize the use of that insidery jargon or different abbreviations as much as you possibly can. And sometimes we can't get around it. So just making sure that you're explaining what you mean to the group, assuming that not everybody has been marinating in this program for the past few months and may just need a little bit more context for what you're talking about. Again, when we get to those interactive parts, try to speak to the whole group and minimize some of those side conversations that aren't necessarily part of today's agenda. I know we've all been on calls like this where somebody will reference something really interesting or exciting in their community, and you want to ask them a bunch of questions about that. If that comes up, you reach out to us and we can help facilitate some of those connections outside of this meeting. But really want to make sure that we stay on agenda here today, since we do have a lot to get through. Everyone is a teacher and a learner today. So just put that out there to have folks be mindful of, when you need to step back and listen to what somebody else is speaking, or vice versa, when you should speak up more and have something valuable to contribute from your lived experience. And really building on that, just be your authentic self and don't fear leaning into uncomfortable topics, especially when we get to that interactive part here at the end, really wanting to hear what other folks might bring up during these input sessions and try to give each other some constructive feedback. And then before we get into it today, I put the link in the chat. You probably should have gotten it when you registered for this session as well. And I'll drop it in one more time. If you haven't had a chance to download that PDF of our Talking Points toolkit, it was made to kind of go hand in hand with this session. So it will be useful to have that open. And likewise, if you can have something in front of you to kind of jot down some thoughts and notes as we go through things, that's going to be helpful for you as well. All right, so now we're going to get into the actual content of the presentation and training here today, now that we've got some of that housekeeping stuff out of the way. So first off, what are we even preparing for? What is the reason for needing to have all of these different prep sessions today? So this all comes back to the Inflation Reduction Act. If you are not familiar with that, it is a massive piece of federal legislation that was passed way back in 2022 at this point, late summer of 2022. There's a lot of things in that bill, but primarily it is a clean energy and climate bill. And the estimate is that it will result in around $391 billion of federal investment in different clean energy and climate action. The majority of that money, around 2/3 of it, is going to be in the form of tax credits or loans from the federal government. The remaining third, and one of the pieces that we're most interested in, is going to be different grants and programs to state and local governments, tribes, community-based organizations, or in the case of what we're talking about today, direct incentives to consumers and households related to climate and clean energy. So that's the big law that got passed that encompasses a lot of different things that you might have heard about. Zeroing in a little bit more to what we're going to be talking about today, one of the programs within the Inflation Reduction Act was this home energy rebates program. And unfortunately, it's kind of gone under a lot of different names at the Department of Energy before they settled on just calling them the Home Energy Rebates Program. So you may have heard some different acronyms or things with it. But it is a little under $9 billion in funding at the Department of Energy to create rebates for low to moderate income households. And that money is divided pretty roughly evenly into two separate forms of rebates. And we're talking about them both here today. So the first, which you may have heard referred to as HERE or HERA, are these home electrification and appliance rebates. And these are rebates at the point of sale, so they're knocking off part of the cost of specific appliances or measures right at the point that you're buying them. So you're calling a contractor to install a heat pump in your home, and that rebate is going to be applied if you qualify for it right on that initial bill for that project. That second half of the money are these home efficiency rebates, or sometimes they're called the homes rebates. They are for combinations of projects that are either measured or modeled to reduce that household's energy usage by at least 20%. So basically, somebody comes out, they do an audit of your home, and they say, well, we think we can reduce your home energy usage by at least 20% if we do X, Y, and Z. And that could be a combination of new HVAC equipment, plus some insulation or window replacement or things like that, as long as it gets you to that 20% mark or better. And then after the fact, once those savings are demonstrated, you would receive that rebate for that. So these are these two separate programs. And again, they're both intended to be aimed at these low to moderate income households that would struggle to afford to do these projects on their own. The other key thing to know about them is that they're not going to be administered directly by the Department of Energy or the federal government. It is federal money, but it's going to go to states, territories, and tribes first. So every state has been allocated a share of that $8.8 billion, and they're going to be responsible for designing, implementing, and running their own programs. So within each state, the agency that's going to be responsible for it is what we call a state energy office. The Department of Energy has what they call the State and Community Energy Program, and this is used to fund energy programs at the state level, and the agency or department in each state that receives that money is their state energy office. And that varies from state to state where that's actually housed. So, you can see the list here of the 8 states that we cover. It ranges from, specific development offices to the state commerce department to their Department of Natural Resources. It's just wherever those states thought it made the most sense to direct those funds when this DOE state energy program launched in the 70s. So that's going to vary from state to state who is ultimately responsible for running these rebate programs. So within that, I said before, the funds have been allocated to each state, but those state energy offices are still going to have to actually apply to DOE to get those funds it's a very long application that's going to show their full proposed plan to implement these programs. And they have until the end of January 2025 to get those into the Department of Energy. And there's a bunch of different boxes that they have to check before they send those applications in. And one of them, and this is the whole reason for this effort on behalf of the coalition, is that they're required to hold at least one public input session to solicit community input on their proposed deployment plans. And in their applications, they have to show how this input was used in their program design. So these are really key opportunities that are coming up for members of the public to influence how these programs are going to get rolled out, what gets emphasized, what the outreach for them looks like. There are some minimum guidelines that the Department of Energy has for the states and how they do these programs, but they do have a fair amount of leeway in discretion. So it's really important that we are talking to these state offices about how they're going to run and manage these programs. A couple other things to keep in mind as we kind of go forward here. I know I'm laying out a lot of information. We are going to come up on a question break here in a little bit. In many cases, the state energy offices will probably be hiring a third-party contractor to either help them design the program or run the program or both. So they may be the ones conducting these input sessions, and DOE has a percentage of each state's funding that they're allowed to pay for things like this. We've also seen, and this is a change since the first of these prep sessions we did back in January that's come up. Some states may submit an early application just around some of their administrative and planning parts before doing their public engagement. So we've seen Indiana, Minnesota, those are the two big ones that have gone that route. So they will still have a longer full implementation application that they have to submit to DOE. But I just bring that up because I know some folks see that and they think they've already missed their opportunity to participate, and that's not necessarily the case. I'm going to pause and get a drink of water here. Sorry for the froggy throat there for a second. All right. And this is some of those early timelines that we've seen, just so you can get an example of what this is looking like at the state level. So this is from Indiana's Office of Energy Development. So they applied for that early administrative funding back in September of last year. They were invited earlier this year to be a part of early application cohort with Department of Energy. So they put in that initial application earlier this year as part of that. But now they're in this phase of working to develop through the early part of this year to develop that implementation blueprint. And this is where their big public engagement process is going to happen before they submit their implementation plan later this year. And then DOE will review their application, and hopefully, they're hoping by the end of this year, they'll actually get approval and be able to launch that program in their state. Similarly, this is another example of that from Michigan. So again, they submitted last year to get some of that early admin planning stuff. They hired their consultants the beginning of this year, and now they've begun their stakeholder engagement process, and they're shooting for getting their application in by the end of May, hopefully have that approved by the end of July so they can start rolling that out in the fall. So this is just an example of what some of these timelines are looking like at the state level. In terms of each state's input sessions, again, focusing on the 8 states that Midwest BDC primarily focuses on when are they going to be happening for you. So if we have any Wisconsin folks on the call today, their main public input session process already happened. It happened through February and early March. So they are now in a phase of getting their final application approved by the state's utility commission because of a little bit of weird quirks of how where Wisconsin's energy office is housed and what their process is. So the public input sessions that we're talking about today, again, have already happened in Wisconsin, but there are still opportunities through the early part of this month to submit written comments on their application before that gets sent to DOE. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, please reach out. I think there's still time to influence that, even if it won't look exactly what it's going to look like for some of the other states on the call here today. We have 2 states that are in progress or have announced coming up soon when their input sessions are happening. And I can get those links here in the chat for folks as well who are joining us from those states. So the first is Michigan's, started in late March. They did an informational session. They did an informational session on March 20th, and then they did their first kickoff virtual input session on last week on the 26th. And now this week they're starting today, starting their round of in-person sessions. So you can see the different dates there. They're doing 5 of those at different points across the state. And then at the end of the month on the 24th, they're doing a second virtual listening session. And they are, I think, recording those and putting them up on the website as they go. So if you're not able to attend those or want to hear an example of some of the other comments that folks have had during those first couple of sessions, you can find those on that Eagle website. And then Missouri has announced the dates for theirs as well. They're coming up in a couple of weeks. So they're kicking off with an in-person input session at their offices in Jefferson City on the 16th. And then they're offering 2 virtual dates, an evening one on the 18th and an afternoon session on the 20th. And we'll put that link in the chat for our Missouri folks who haven't seen that yet. So those are the 2 that are currently coming up very quickly. I will say that we haven't seen an official announcement yet for Minnesota or Indiana, but I would anticipate that those may be coming very quickly, depending on just kind of reading the tea leaves there. And then the 3 that we haven't seen any sort of set timeline yet or indications that they're starting anytime soon are Iowa, Illinois, or Ohio. In those cases, we're still waiting for them to make announcements on hiring implementation contractor or anything like that. So it seems like they're going to be more towards the later part of the year for having those input sessions and getting their applications finalized. So again, I showed that list of those state energy offices earlier, and we'll get the slide deck out to folks that registered afterwards. But really encourage you, if we don't have details yet, but you don't want to miss those announcements when they come out, to sign up for the email updates from those state energy offices, and also making sure that you're being in communication with Midwest BDC as well. We're trying our best to stay on top of that and get that information out to our members as quickly as possible. So I know that was a lot, just kind of giving the lay of the land of what this program is and what this engagement process is that we're trying to help folks organize around. I'm going to pause here for questions, and then we'll get a little bit more into what you all should expect if you're going to attend one of these public input sessions or public input hearings. I do not have a date for Kansas, just reading question there. in the chat. And I will say, I know we have some crossover folks, especially from the Kansas City area, but we don't track Kansas as directly as some of the other states. I am in communication with some national groups, and I have not seen any big announcements from Kansas in those spaces either. So I think they're in a similar phase to Iowa and Ohio and Illinois of just probably not going to be one of these first movers on getting their applications in. All right. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any hands up or anything else in the chat. Okay, well, then we can get into more specifics about these input sessions themselves. So I pulled this screenshot from that Michigan energy office session last week because I attended that, and just pulled this because I think it's a good good example of kind of what to expect in terms of table setting from them. This was part of their setup before they went into those public comments. Again, asking folks to raise their hand if they want to be called on, having that opportunity to submit written follow-up comments to expand on things that folks were saying. And then they had that 3-minute time limit for folks' verbal comments. And that kind of leads into a little bit of this what to expect portion of it, kind of pulled from folks who have participated in some of these earlier state sessions or similar types of hearings in the past. Just sort of what you should expect going into it so you're not caught off guard by anything. So the first is, do take advantage and make sure you're using those links to register for these sessions ahead of time. If you think there's any chance that you might want to go or participate, just go ahead and register for those links ahead of time. And it's important for a couple of reasons. So for the in-person ones, those state energy offices will usually say they're using that to make sure that they can plan appropriately for accommodations for the event, that they've got enough space for everybody who may want to attend, that they're have an idea of how many comments they might be taking that day. And I will say, sometimes for these, if folks are not there right away and they don't have that registration, sometimes they'll assume that nobody wants to come and comment and wrap up those in-person sessions early. So again, just as much as you can show like, yes, we will be there, yes, we will be interested, that indicates to them to be prepared for that. And then for the virtual sessions, maybe even more than the in-person, super key to make sure that you're registering for it. And the main reason for that is that most of the time we aren't seeing the links to these meetings being posted publicly, right? They will not put the link to that Zoom or Teams meeting or whatever they're using directly on the website. I would assume for security reasons as much as anything else. They're just emailing that to the folks who have actually gone through the registration process. So if you're expecting to just hop on that day without registering, maybe in for a little bit of a rude awakening with that. So make sure you're registering for your session ahead of time and getting that on your calendar. We saw it on the slide from Michigan, but be prepared that there will be time limits for those verbal comments. 2 to 3 minutes is pretty typical. So with that, really important to be concise, hit your main bullet points and have maybe 1 or 2 key personal connections or pieces of data that you want to reference. And again, you can always follow up with a longer written comment on top of that that's referencing what you said. So it's super powerful to have that verbal element to it and have them hear your main point in the room. So you want to make sure that you do that, but also really critical to follow up with those written notes if there's a longer explanation or supporting data that you want to reference. And with those time limits, really recommending to folks that you script your comments ahead of time. Do not go in and try to wing it because that time goes fast if you don't have your thoughts together ahead of time. A recommendation from James Trice, our co-leader of this working group, is that he's found that 2 minutes is usually around 300 words if you write it out. So maybe just kind of have it up in that Word document ahead of time and see how long that is. Does this seem like something that I can realistically get out in 2 or 3 minutes, or do I need to trim it down a little bit? And then again, make sure you're practicing it ahead of time. And you don't have to, spend hours practicing it, but just run through it a couple of times to make sure that you're comfortable getting that out, and really have a good feel for what that 2 minutes feels like when you're there. And that's going to be part of our time here today as well. A couple other things to keep in mind. Typically, the facilitators from the state office or their contractors will say this right at the top of their meetings, but it's good to know going into it ahead of time. They're usually not there to answer questions at these sessions. They may have a separate educational Q&A that their office does ahead of time or afterwards about the program. But in terms of these public hearings that they're required to do to get input on the program, they'll usually flat out say, we are just here to listen to comments and take notes on what we're hearing. We're not here to answer questions today. So don't be offended by that. Don't be surprised by that. And again, you can always follow up with those offices and their staff after the event if you have some of those questions as well. Most of the time, they're very receptive to that. It's just not going to happen in this specific venue. Other thing to keep in mind is even if you've registered ahead of time, they're not going to have a list of folks that they're making sure that they're calling on everybody that registered or anything like that. You will have to actively, either get in line or put your hand up at an in-person event or in a virtual one. Make sure that you're following whatever instructions they give, whether that be putting, your hand up function or putting something in the chat to make sure that they know that you are wanting to make a comment. And you will need to be proactive about that. So I know sometimes that's not the most comfortable thing to do. Just want folks to be mentally prepared to do that. And then just one more time, practice your comments ahead of time. Even just running through it 1 or 2 times before you hop on to that Zoom or go into the room is going to be super helpful for making sure that you're effectively relaying what you want to say that day. So I'm gonna quick give a couple of examples of what comments may look like or sound like that I've scripted out ahead of time to kind of fit into that 2-minute piece. And then we'll take some questions before we get into our next section here. Hello, my name is Jacob Serfling. I currently own my own home, but a substantial portion of my neighborhood is single-family or duplex home renters. Like many parts of Des Moines, we experienced substantial flooding in 2018. Our next-door neighbor, a renter, worked with his landlord to make repairs and also used the opportunity for other improvements. In 2020, they were informed that due to favorable market in our area, in the increased value of the property the landlord would be selling, and they were to be out in 90 days. The family was a beloved backbone of our street, and it has been noticeable that they moved. I reference this story because currently the Department of Energy is only requiring states to enforce restrictions on evictions or rent increases for 2 years when property owners and landlords are taking advantage of these rebates to fund improvements in their properties. I believe this is going to end up being insufficient and that the state should be looking to go above and beyond on their own as part of their implementation plan and require at least 5 years of protections when landlords are utilizing these rebates so that participants work locked out of so many other programs to make home and household improvements can benefit from these rebates without fear of displacement. Thank you. Okay, so that's one example of something, and that's more of one drawing from personal experience or things like that. Second example that I'll give is maybe more if you're speaking on behalf of an organization or want to hit a bunch of bullet points that you're going to follow up with at a later date. So this is more of what I do when I'm going and speaking on behalf of Midwest BDC in these hearings. Hello, my name is Jacob Serfling, and today I'm representing the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. Our members have identified a few main areas of concern that I'd like to uplift today. One, these rebates should be utilized to encourage whole home electrification as much as possible. In the case of the homes rebates, where DOE has left an opening to allow gas equipment to be rebated as long as it's more efficient than what it replaces, the state should use their own discretion and only utilize funding for electric or fuel neutral measures. In the case of the HERE rebates, the state should not assume that households are aware of the full scope of what they potentially qualify for and should work with program partners to educate them on the combinations that could have the biggest overall impact. 2, these programs should primarily prioritize households without other means to afford these energy upgrades. And this should be the primary lens that the state uses when talking about funding set-asides, rebate amounts for different income levels, or allowing retroactive eligibility in their application to DOE. And finally, renters have had historically an incredibly difficult time accessing other energy upgrade programs, and they have justifiable fears about rebate funding building improvements being used to raise rents or push them out of their homes. The state should consider DOE's required protections a bare minimum and seek longer protections and strong enforcement measures. Thank you for your time and consideration today. We look forward to seeing the full implementation plan and application. Okay. So those are 2 examples of what those comments might look like. Again, I know a number of states that have already had their sessions have recorded them and have them up on their website. So if you want to go and look at those, that can be super useful as well for getting your thoughts together on this. I am going to pause though and see if folks have any questions on what to expect with these hearings. And then we're going to get into our last little bit of content here, going through that talking points toolkit and trying to get you start thinking about what you might want to say when you're attending those hearings. So I see Carlton with his hand up.
Yeah, Jacob Carlton out of Michigan. I'm curious about the rebates for the low to moderate income. And I know it's kind of stating this like it's the tail end. And that has been the problem in the past. If you don't have the front end to load it as a low and moderate income, how is that being presented?
Right. Yeah. So, and feel free to back me up if I'm missing the mark on your question here, Carlton. I probably breezed past it a little bit too quickly in that front section of the presentation, but these rebates in law, from the way that the Inflation Reduction Act is written, are intended to go to low to moderate income households only. And they're defining low income household as at 80% or below of the area median income of the state. And moderate is that 80 to 150% of the area median income. So already at the basis, there's that income qualification piece with these rebates. Now, within that, there are some other things that DOE is asking states to think about, and certainly we should be asking states to think about as well. One is they're going to be asked to demonstrate how their rollout of their state's rebates is going to serve the federal government's Justice 40 goals. And if you're not familiar with Justice 40, it's a commitment of the Biden administration that 40% of federal investments with these programs are going to go to environmental justice or otherwise underserved communities. And they have a screening tool where they've identified what they consider those communities could be. So that's going to be part of what states are going to be asked to do, is to show how they're going to make sure that that minimum 40% happens. And then there's a whole host of other things that states could potentially do or think about with how they're steering those out. So one is there's maximum allowable rebate amounts that DOE has set for certain income brackets, but states can choose to do less or request permission from DOE to do more if they want to kind of weigh their rebates more heavily towards low income brackets through that way. They also have minimum set asides that DOE is requiring with the rebates. So it varies a little bit from state to state, but in general, for every state, it's around 40% of the rebates have to go to that lowest income bracket, and 10% of the rebates have to go to multifamily renters in that lowest income bracket. So states are going to have to do those set asides at a minimum. They do have flexibility to do more if they think that that's the best way to hit some of those Justice 40 goals, or even just meet the spirit of the program. But those are the minimum requirements. Did that answer your question, Carlton?
Somewhat. I'm just curious when you start talking about the, say if they try to reach that 20% mark of reduction and they need window replacement. Does that homeowner has to do that window replacement and look for the rebate after they have got that done, or where do you get help in that whole process of what it costs for the window replacement?
Right. Okay. I understand that now. Yeah, that is a so I will say for the HERE rebates that are for like a specific measure, that those rebates are going to be applied right at the upfront bill for it. It's a little bit fuzzier on that second program, that whole home efficiency one that you're referencing. And some of that is going to be up to states to figure out what that looks like specifically in their states. But I know DOE is really encouraging states to figure out figure out a way to have that be the least impact on the actual homeowners and program participants possible. So that may look more like some of that upfront cost being carried by the contractors, and then they're being compensated based on demonstrating that they're actually hitting those savings marks with it or things like that. But again, that's going to be something that's part of each state's implementation decision. We don't really know yet for sure.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, thanks,
Yeah,
Jacob.
no problem. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. Then the last piece of me talking at you all is going to be going through this talking points toolkit that we put together. And again, I'll put the link in the chat for anybody who hadn't downloaded or printed that out yet, so that you can get that. A lot of this is the same content that's in that, but these are talking points that our federal policy working group developed. They're the basis of what I go and give for verbal comments or submit for written comments on behalf of the coalition. And hopefully they're a good jumping off point for what you may want to go and submit and say as well. So really the goal by the end of this part of the presentation is that you're going to have some sort of a rough sketch of the comments that you'd like to give during your state's input process. So with that in mind, as I'm going through what our thoughts were, really encourage you to be taking notes, maybe identifying within our talking points the one or two that resonate the most for you that you'd like to focus on. Maybe as we're going, be thinking about some of that personal lived experience that you might connect to your comments of, how would you benefit personally from these rebates, or would you have benefited from something like this in the past had it existed? If you're a renter, have you experienced some of these things that we talk about as a concern? In those cases, have you had a good or a bad experience with, say, a utility-sponsored energy efficiency program that you want the state to be mindful with of as they're implementing this? Just kind of want you all to have those thoughts in mind as I walk through some of our thinking on Midwest BDC's talking points, so you can start translating that into the comments that you'll want to give at these input sessions. So again, just kind of walking through the timeline of where these came from. Again, this has been a collaborative effort on behalf of our members that participate in our bi-weekly federal policy working group. Back in January of last year, the Department of Energy issued a request for information that had 59 questions on it on how this program should be implemented at the federal level, that we went through and responded to as a group, submitting those back in March of last year, so over a year ago now. And then throughout the spring and summer of last year, we had some preliminary discussions with state offices that would give us some of their time to talk about this program. It was way too early to be having some of those conversations because nobody had any details on anything yet, but it was good to at least get some wheels turning about what the areas for concern with these programs would be. And then at the end of last summer in August, we finally got that first guidance and look at what the application process would look like for states to get their share of the money. And we spent a good chunk of last fall going through those documents as a group and finding those remaining areas of concern. Were some of the things that we had talked about earlier in the year had been addressed by DOE. Some of them were still being left up to the states to determine. And that is kind of how we came up with these main talking points and this toolkit that you have here today. So there's 4 main themes that kind of bubbled to the surface. I'm going to kind of talk through them now. The first, and you heard it in my example comments, that states should use these rebates to encourage full home decarbonization. So the number one with a bullet piece of that is that none of these rebates should be used to incentivize gas appliances. And there's only one portion of this where that's a risk, and that's in that homes program, that whole home energy efficiency one, where there are scenarios where if the home in question, currently had a really old gas furnace or gas boiler or something like that, and you could put in a newer piece of equipment and it would, still result in energy savings, even though it's still leaving that home fossil fuel dependent. DOE is going to allow states to do some of that if they choose to do it, but states don't have to do it. So we're really trying to talk them out of it and say, hey, only use this for non-fossil fuel equipment or fuel neutral measures like insulation or window replacements or things like that that will still result in energy savings, but not lock folks into gas equipment for longer than they have to be. And then the second piece of that we're raising up under that theme is that there's this risk that, the participants who could benefit the most from these programs aren't going to know the full scope of what they qualify for. Maybe they hear about the rebate for their water heater in an emergency replacement scenario, and they get their rebated heat pump water heater installed, and that's great. But there was this whole host of other things that they qualified for that they went through this process, and nobody made a point to make those connections for them. Or somebody goes through their state's weatherization assistance program and never finds out that they also qualify for these other rebates that could lead to even more improvement and benefits for their household. So making sure that states are being thoughtful about helping program participants make those connections. The second theme that came up was this idea of renters and what safeguards are going to be there for tenants. So a little bit more background on how the program's going to work. I touched on a little bit in my answer to Carlton's question before, but at a minimum, each state is going to be required to allocate around 10% of the rebates to serve low-income multifamily housing. So we know in every state, at least some of these rebates are going to go to landlords on behalf of the tenants in their properties. Now, DOE has put in language in the applications that states have to enforce 2 years of protections from evictions or rent increases based on these rebate improvements. We as a coalition feel like it should be closer to 5 years to really have folks be comfortable and protected from displacement on the back of this program, and are also raising up concerns about what does the enforcement of those protections really look like? Is it just words on paper, or is there a meaningful mechanism that states are putting into their application of what sort of fines or other corrective measures are going to be in place when landlords are not abiding by those restrictions? The third theme that popped up is this idea that states really need to keep the emphasis of the programs on increasing the affordability of these measures to the most groups possible. And we bring this up because $9 billion sounds like a lot, but that money is going to go extremely fast, especially when you think about how that's divvied up amongst states and the amount of some of these rebates that they could be. I've heard estimates as extreme as, like, we think in some states this money is going to be gone in 4 months or something like that. I don't know if it'll be that fast, but there's definitely a risk that the pool of rebates could dry up before some of these most underserved or at-risk environmental justice communities are even aware that there's a program for them to benefit from. And we know that DOE is requiring that 40% set aside for low-income households. I will just pull back the curtain on our working group discussions a little bit. I know there were some in our coalition who felt that we should be telling states to make that 100% on their own. There were other folks who had different opinions, that there should still be some flexibility for higher incomes, because that doesn't necessarily translate into means or resources to actually do some of this. I'll let you make your own judgment calls on that. And then the other thing that we're concerned about besides the set-asides is DOE has also opened the door to states giving some retroactive eligibility for projects through that whole home efficiency program. So basically, states have flexibility to say, if you did a project on your home that resulted in 20% energy savings, and it happened after the law was passed in 2022, but before our state officially launches the program and starts doing the whole outreach and application process, that some states may allow folks to go ahead and apply for those rebates after the fact. And I think our concern as a coalition has been like, well, if you were able to do that without the program even being in place in your state, are you really the type of household that these rebates were meant to serve? So we're really just trying to encourage states to be very cautious about opening that door. And then the final kind of area of focus for our working group was around these community benefits plans. So I talked again a little bit in my answer to Carlton that states, as part of their application, are going to have to demonstrate how they're using these rebates to support those Justice 40 goals, and benefiting those underserved communities. So that's this community benefits plan that will be included as part of their application. And yeah, it'll have to show how they're supporting four key goals. One, meaningful community and labor engagement. Two, engage and support a skilled and qualified workforce. Three, advanced diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And then again, how they'll contribute to that Justice 40 goal, that 40% of overall benefits from federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities. So there's a lot of pieces within that. Here are some of the things that we've seen in some of the early states that we think are positive things to uplift and we'd like to see more of. So specific metrics for community organization partners that increase each year of the program. So making sure that states or their implementation contractors are partnering with organizations that are actually on the ground and have a proven track record and relationship with those underserved communities, that are making sure that the correct kinds of outreach and education for those participants are actually happening. Mechanisms for identifying where a lack of contractors in those underserved communities is leading to folks not actually being able to take advantage of those programs, and training any targeting or training and recruitment portion of their project accordingly. We've seen cases of states partnering with public health partners to target outreach to households with asthma sufferers, or plans to target trainings for clean energy jobs related to these rebates to past participants in the rebate program. So, if they're planning to do energy auditor training or something like that as part of supporting these rebates, making sure that somebody who has received rebates through the program learns about that job opportunity as well. And then we're seeing in using that as a way to get more folks from these underserved communities into these jobs in the clean energy field. And then some other ideas that our members, have indicated that they'd like to see in these plans that you may want to uplift as well. Again, that meaningful plan to identify and partner with those culturally appropriate, community-based organizations to conduct that outreach and education, training those community partners to educate participants beyond just the basics of how this rebate program is going to function, but how they can combine it with other programs that they qualify for. If there's a more advantageous utility rate that might work within their newly electrified heating system, having education and assistance with that process. Just understanding the unique context of their home and how they could benefit from these upgrades. Just making sure that that participant education piece doesn't stop at here's how you access the rebates and you're kind of on your own to figure out what's going to be best for you beyond that. Also making sure that communities are invested in the program by making the data on how the rebates are performing as accessible as possible. And again, working with partners to analyze what they're impacting beyond that energy reduction or that impact on household income. So an example of that, maybe partnering with somebody that can show that these rebates are leading to improvements in air quality or other things that can impact health outcomes in those underserved communities. So that's a lot. And there's more details on a lot of that in that. And I know we've had some questions on these talking points as we go. So I'm just going to go through the chat here, and then I see we have some hands up as well. So we have a question from Kiaja in the chat, and I am so sorry if I butchered that name. How do we receive a copy of this recording after? Yep, so we are recording today, and our intent will be to make at least this portion of it, probably not the breakout rooms for privacy reasons. We'll have this portion of it up on our website and YouTube channel, and we'll make sure in the follow-up email that you know how to find all of those things. We have a question from Vicky in the chat. The appliance rebates, will states give money directly to the appliance vendors into the contractors, and what would stop Home Depot or contractors from raising their prices? Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that again is part of the enforcement mechanism that states are going to have to put into their application. So again, that will probably look a little bit different from state to state in terms of what it's going to look like for qualified things, or how many of these things are going to be self installed measures and things like that, where you'd be going out to a Home Depot. But I think what's going to end up happening is that in most cases, there will be like a qualified contractor partners list for these programs that you'll go through to do it. And the hope would be that those state offices are watching those approved contractors like a hawk. And if you're pulling that kind of stuff, you're going to get kicked out of being an approved contractor for the program. So that's part of it. And then what are the community organization partners that have already been identified in early states? And yeah, so we've really only seen a full application from one state within our footprint, and that's that Wisconsin one that's waiting for approval. In Wisconsin's case, it was kind of a unique situation that they already had an existing statewide energy efficiency program that all of their utilities have to pay into. That's not typical for most of the other states that we work in. It's usually the utilities kind of run their own thing. So with that, they already had a little bit of an existing network of community partners with that. I will say with that though, what I thought was positive in that application was that they had metrics for the first 5 years of this program that showed, hey, in year one, we're going to have 10 community organization partners with we're going to demonstrate that they're based in these Justice 40 census tracts, and then they had goals for each subsequent year to increase that number of partners and have it be targeted to the identified underserved communities where they weren't seeing high levels of participation with the rebates. So I think we'll see a lot more things like that, where maybe the first year of the rebates will be a little bit of a trial run, and then states will kind of see where their trouble spots are and seek to improve it in the second year. And Vicky, I see, yep, I can dig up that link. If I don't do it in the chat here before we're done today, I'll send a follow-up email. I'm sure it's in one of the many tabs I have open on my computer. And then I see Odalis in the chat has put in this link for folks on some immigrant inclusion recommendations that were created by Just Solutions and NPNA. Yeah, I've seen that come out since we developed our talking points document. And I think there are a lot of great suggestions in there too for folks to draw from. So certainly encourage folks to take a look at that. All right. Any other questions on anything that we've talked about up to this point?
Yeah, I guess I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Which is, from your experience, say with Wisconsin, which has already had their public input sessions, and just generally as a coalition, participating, since the beginning in the development of these applications and programs, like what recommendations would you have as far as like how to really follow through and ensure that some of the things that we're recommending get picked up, right? It's one thing to speak at the public info session as an individual, and then there's the ability to send written comment, but like individuals versus organizations versus like, yeah, speaking from any like specific experience you've had with Wisconsin or elsewhere, like what's sort of the full breadth of making sure that the things that are important to our communities really get included?
Yeah, I think being a consistent presence is probably the number one thing with it. And I know that that is a lot to ask of community organizations or individuals. I mean, it is. It's a time commitment to do some of those things. But I did touch on, part of our process since IRA has been passed has been, periodically trying to set up, calls and things like that on behalf of our members with some of these state energy offices. And I'll say right now, they're all very completely overwhelmed with trying to get these applications together. So in some cases, like the response to the request of like, hey, do you have time to meet with our organization and just field some questions might be like public input process is coming, like, hold on, and that'll be an opportunity for it. But I will say in a lot of cases, I think this is such a new program for most of those offices that they're pretty darn receptive to input from folks right now. And we, you know, in states like Indiana and Ohio, Minnesota, we have definitely had, I think, a good amount of success of just, hey, do you have 30 minutes or an hour to talk through kind of what you're thinking and hear what our concerns are? And then they know who you are. They know that you're there as a resource, you know, that they can draw from. You know, most of the folks that work in these offices, they want this program to be successful. They care about the goals of the program. If there's a feeling of you may have insights that they don't that can lead to that happening, they're going to want to hear about it. But they don't always have capacity to seek you out. So you may have to kind of take that first step of, you know, kind of trying to identify on an email or things like that. So, you know, another thing that we didn't talk about, but I would recommend folks do is like write down the names of all those staff people that are facilitating that hearing and go find, you know, if they don't give you an email, go find one for those folks and follow up after the fact and say, hey, you know, as you get closer to finalizing the application, we'd love to hear more, you know, and things like that. That does tend to be stuff that they're receptive to in those offices. All right.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Great. All right. Well, I think it took us maybe a little bit longer to get through some of that and answer questions than I had anticipated, which is totally fine because they were all very good questions. So I don't know if we'll kind of have time before folks have to start dropping off for this full breakout rooms agenda. But again, I'm hopeful that some of you were taking notes and jotting things down that you might want to say in these public input sessions as we go. So it had been my intent to have you kind of go into breakout rooms and give, you know, kind of practice giving these planned comments to each other. I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that, but I will see if we have any brave souls that wanted to get a chance to do that and practice. I'm seeing folks dropping off, so that prospect is scaring folks off real quick. But I will say, if you wanted to take a shot at giving your comments now and getting some feedback on things, happy to hang on the line to do that. But otherwise, that is the presentation for today. No worries. Okay, well then, just in closing, I'll say you can find us on all the social media stuff at Midwest BDC or midwestdecarb.org. We will send follow-up emails to folks that are registering, and part of that, for those of you that are remaining, I'll make the call. If and when you do participate in your state's public input sessions, we are always interested to hear what that experience is like for you on the ground, especially as we get to some of these later states. These are all insights and experiences that our other coalition members can draw from. So please, you know, just reach out and say, hey, I went, this is kind of what it looked like in my state. You know, this is something that I wish I would have done differently. We're always happy to hear about that. So don't hesitate to reach out. But otherwise, I will let our bitter enders here get on with their day. And we'll see you around. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.